Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember to support, subscribe. The horrifying afterlife of Queen Elizabeth I. Now Elizabeth I was Queen of England for 44 years and 4 months, and after years of fighting who would become her successor, as she had no children, when she actually died, there was no dynastic struggle and no bloodshed. The country was in shock and was mourning their beloved queen. She was the only monarch many living in the country had ever known, and for the era, 44 years was a far greater part of a man's age. Elizabeth had fought off smallpox during her earlier reign, but she then lived for many years after, and it was noted by the chronicler William Campden that Elizabeth's health began its decline just 3 months before her death. She was noted to have always enjoyed her life in good health with no impairment, and that was attributed to her abstinence from wine or a temperate diet. Elizabeth at this point became aware that her body was becoming weak, and then, on a cold and rainy January day, she left Westminster for the last time. Elizabeth took herself to Richmond to refresh. But this wasn't any help to Elizabeth. She was 69 years old and her health was now on a downward spiral with no hopes of reprieve. She fell into a state of despair and physical decay, and it was at this point that she would begin to increase her time spent in prayer, and her only confidant, the only person she would speak with, was the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London, and they encouraged her to turn her mind to God. It has been handed down through history that upon Elizabeth's death that her inauguration ring was taken from her finger, but after delving into a text from Westminster Abbey, hidden in history since the Victorian era, it seems that Elizabeth actually asked for the ring to be filed off her finger. It appears that the ring that symbolised her marriage to the crown had become small on her finger, and the ring had painfully become embedded in the skin, causing her a lot of pain and discomfort. The Tudor era was one filled with superstitions, and Elizabeth taking off her ring was seen as a bad omen. She was effectively saying that her contracts to her country had ended, and that the marriage was dissolved. This was seen by her people as Elizabeth announcing her immediate death. Campden wrote down what Elizabeth's symptoms were as the end drew near, and he notes that the almonds in her throat swelled. I am assuming that this means her glands, but one can't be sure. He wrote that although this quickly went away, her appetite had then failed. Elizabeth is then thought to have fallen into a deep melancholy, and she seemed to be troubled by a grief of sorts. It is thought that her grief, although there have been many different explanations as to this cause, was because she was in fact old for the time, and those she had loved and grown up with had all died before her, a sense of grief caused by loneliness. It is then recorded, and I quote, that by March Elizabeth fell into a heavy dullness. It is thought that she wouldn't speak as her throat was dry and sore, and it was then, with her death approaching, that her Lord Keeper and Secretary begged Elizabeth to name her successor, which she did with a gasping breath, naming James VI of Scotland. It is common knowledge that Elizabeth died in her privy chambers in Richmond Palace, a palace that was just over 100 years old at the time, having been rebuilt by her grandfather Henry VII, after a disastrous fire that largely destroyed the building in the December of 1497. The palace was situated on the Thames, around 10 miles from Westminster, and a Tudor herald noted that it was in pleasant surroundings set between divers high and pleasant mountains in a valley with good fields where the air is most wholesome. I am not surprised that Elizabeth chose Richmond Palace as her refuge when her health began to fail her. And before Elizabeth died, she made it 100% clear that she did not want to be disemboweled, but shortly after she passed, Robert Cecil ordered the surgeons to do so. So, Elizabeth was embalmed and then her body transferred to a lead-lined coffin made of wood. She then laid in state at Richmond, and it is believed that this was possibly in the palace's chapel. There she stayed for several days before being transferred to a barge and brought downstream to the Palace of Whitehall. Elizabeth Southwell, a lady-in-waiting for Elizabeth during her final months, reported that the Queen's coffin was draped in velvet, and that it was watched every night by 6 or so ladies. There is no confirmation of where Elizabeth's funeral rites were held, but I am inclined to believe that the chapel would have been the most appropriate place. Another report from Southwell is actually rather gruesome, but it is in fact a common occurrence for the kings and queens of the era, especially Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, but Henry's was thought to be due to his obesity, where Elizabeth was not subject to the same vices he was. Southwell said that she heard a loud crack coming from the Queen's coffin as her head and body broke open from the pressure of the gases being released after her body had rotted. The force of the explosion splintered the wood, lead and cerecloth. It is believed that if Elizabeth's wishes were followed and she had not been opened up, then it would have been much worse. The Queen's funeral was then held on the 28th of April and was just 1 month after she had died. Her coffin was conveyed in a grand procession down what was once called King Street, but is now known as Whitehall. She was then taken to Westminster Abbey for her burial. The number of people involved in the procession goes into the hundreds and ranged from knights, squires, lords and ladies and other nobility, as well as men and women from the poorer population. Her funeral has been remembered through time as one filled with great sorrow and extremely solemn, and the Lady Marquess of Northampton, Helena Snakenburg, acted as her chief mourner. Here is a quote found in the archives of Westminster. The city of Westminster was subcharged with a multitude of all sorts of people in their streets, houses, leads and gutters that came to see the obsequies. There was such a general sighing, groaning and weeping, as the like has not been seen or known in the memory of man. Now there is a drawing of the funeral procession, and it shows the Queen's hearse in some detail. The image was found in John Nichol's collection of contemporary documents entitled The Progresses and Public Processions of Queen Elizabeth. In this he states that the lively effigy of the Queen's whole body was dressed in her Parliament robes, with her crown on her head and a sceptre in her hand. The effigy rests upon Elizabeth's coffin, which is draped in purple velvet and pulled by 4 horses in black. There is a canopy above the hearse, and noblemen carry 12 banners, with 6 on either side of the coffin. The Historical Memorials of Westminster Abbey states that these were emblazoned with the emblems of the House of York, but excluded those of Lancaster. After the funeral service, Elizabeth's coffin was deposited in the vault of Henry VII's chapel. She was laid to rest with her grandmother and grandfather, Elizabeth of York and Henry VII, but in 1607 she was moved to be in the same vault as her half-sister, Mary I, a Protestant princess alongside a Catholic Mary. An interesting fact is that there is a note in the Westminster account sheets for 46 shillings and 4 pence for the removal of the Queen's body to her new resting place. There is also a magnificent monument costing £1,485, around a year and a half's income for a nobleman, commissioned by her successor, James VI I. The monument was carved in white marble, and it was smaller than that of Mary Queen of Scots, James's mother. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. In a book written by Arthur Stanley called The Memorials of Westminster Abbey, there is a piece of text where he describes his explorations of the tombs below Westminster Abbey. He was given permission by Queen Victoria, and on his way to try and find the coffin of James I, he explored a narrow aisle located underground between the eastern end of Elizabeth's monument and those of James's own infant daughters. He had already looked in this area before. It was empty and seemed of little interest. However, upon closer inspection, Stanley found a tiny hole in one of the walls, and upon peering inside, he saw a narrow vault containing 2 coffins, one placed upon the other. The account states the following: There was no disorder or decay, except the centering wood at the head of the upmost coffin had fallen in, and some of the sides were crumbling, which had drawn away part of the decaying lid. He then continues to say that although no coffin plate was present, there was enough of a dim light to see a carved Tudor rose that was simple yet deeply incised in outline. He went on to say that either side of the rose were the carved initials ER, and beneath was the year 1603. He said the lid was decorated with narrow, moulded panelling made of fine oak an inch thick, whilst the base was made of inch elm. The whole thing was covered in red silk velvet, much of which remained attached to the wood. Stanley had found the coffin of Elizabeth I. It was her final resting place, and she was laid directly upon her sister, Mary. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.